You probably know your car payment to the dollar. Maybe it's $650. Maybe it's $780. Or maybe you stretched a little and it's right at $800. You told yourself that's fine because you needed the space or the safety rating or, honestly, because it looked good.
And that number, that monthly payment, is the number you think of when someone asks what your car costs you.
Here's the problem, and it's a problem that compounds quietly for 10 years. The real math on car ownership, the full ledger almost nobody sits down to calculate, is one of the largest hidden costs in the average American household's financial life. It's hidden, not because anyone is concealing it, but because the way we buy cars makes one number extremely visible. Everything else is structurally easy to ignore, and by the time we're done today, you'll have seen the full picture. What you do with it is entirely up to you. Let's talk about how most people actually think about buying a car, because the thinking is reasonable. You need a vehicle, you find something you like, and the dealer or the financing app tells you the monthly payment. You compare that number to your monthly income, decide it's manageable, and you make the call. That's not irrational, that's practical, because cash flow is real, and monthly payments are how most of us budget. The problem isn't that people are careless. The problem is that the monthly payment framing answers the wrong question. The right question isn't, can I afford this payment? The right question is, what is this vehicle actually going to cost me? And those two questions, over the full time you own the vehicle, have very different answers. The American Automobile Association has tracked the total cost of owning and operating a new vehicle every year for decades. Their methodology covers 6 cost categories, which are depreciation, financing charges, fuel, insurance, license and registration, and maintenance and repair. They analyzed the top-selling mid-priced models across 9 vehicle types, standardized over 5 years and 75,000 miles. In their 2024 study, the all-in figure was $12,297 per year. In 2025, it came in at $11,577, a slight improvement year over year. But either way, we're talking about roughly $1,000 a month. And that's not just the loan payment, but everything. If you're paying $700 a month on your loan, the actual cost of that vehicle is closer to $1,000. The other $300 is quietly scattered across categories that never show up as a single line item on your bank statement. That gap between what feels like the cost and what actually is the cost is where this whole conversation lives. Let's start with the costs most people are at least partially aware of, because even the visible costs are larger than expected. The average new car loan in the United States right now runs close to 69 months, according to Experian's automotive finance market data. That's nearly 6 years, and the average interest rate on that loan as of mid-2025 sits around 6.8%. The average loan amount for a new car is now in the range of $43,000 to $44,000. Run those numbers together, and you're looking at monthly payments that cluster around $750 to $770. And that's just the financing, meaning the actual cost of borrowing money to own the vehicle, before anything else is added. Layered on top of that is insurance, which has been rising meaningfully, with the American Automobile Association tracking it as a standard cost category. Then there's fuel, which varies by vehicle and driving habits, calculated in the AAA model at roughly 15,000 miles per year. Then registration, taxes, and licensing fees, numbers that quietly hit once a year and get mentally absorbed into miscellaneous spending. Then basic maintenance, oil changes, tires, wiper blades, and brake pads, none of which is a crisis on its own. Collectively, stacked against a 69-month loan, they add up to something most people have never actually totaled. So even if you account for all of those, the loan, the insurance, the fuel, the maintenance, and the registration, you're already at a number that surprises people.
But those are the categories most people at least know exist. And the one that catches people genuinely off guard is the biggest one. Depreciation is listed first in the AAA study for a reason, because it is on average the single largest cost of owning a new vehicle. In 2024, the AAA estimated the average new car loses approximately $4,680 in value per year. In 2025, that figure came down to around $4,334 as vehicle prices and market conditions shifted. But in either case, we're talking about more than $4,000 a year, every year, in value that simply evaporates. A 2024 study published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics examined automobile depreciation using consumer expenditure survey data. It confirmed what industry sources have long tracked, which is that new cars purchased fresh off the lot lose close to 40% of their value in the first 3 years. The first year is typically the steepest, and some popular models shed nearly a quarter of their purchase price right after leaving the dealership. After year 3, the rate slows, but it doesn't stop, and that's the part that most buyers never fully carry in their heads. Here's what makes this genuinely surprising when you sit with it, because it involves how financing and depreciation interact with each other. Most people who are financing a car and watching depreciation happen simultaneously can end up owing more on the loan than the car is worth. This is sometimes called being underwater or having negative equity, and it's not a fringe situation at all. Because loan terms have stretched to nearly 6 years, while depreciation hits hardest in years 1 through 3, many financed buyers spend years in that position. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York tracks total auto loan debt in the United States, and as of late 2025, that figure stood at $1.667 trillion. Depreciation is not a cash expense you feel. It doesn't come out of your checking account, and there's no notification or statement for it. It's a slow, silent reduction in the asset's value, and because it doesn't feel like spending, most people simply don't count it. The AAA study is one of the few places where it gets added back in as the actual cost it is. So let's put the pieces together, not as a scare tactic, but just as arithmetic, using the 2024 AAA framework. If you were driving a mid-priced new vehicle, you were paying on average roughly $4,680 in depreciation alone. Add financing charges, insurance costs, fuel, maintenance, and registration, and the total comes to over $12,000 per year. Over a 5-year ownership window, which is the AAA's standard horizon, that's north of $60,000 for a vehicle that might have stickered around $40,000. If you're driving a pickup truck, which remains the highest cost category in the AAA study, the numbers are considerably larger. Now we get to the layer that peer-reviewed research suggests almost nobody includes in their mental model when deciding to buy a car. That layer is opportunity cost, and there is actually a body of academic research on this specific blind spot in human decision-making. A study published in the Journal of Behavioral Decision-Making found that people across income levels systematically underweight or entirely ignore opportunity cost when making purchases. The researchers tested different products at different price points and found that both high and low-income participants showed the same pattern of neglect. It's not a knowledge problem. It's a cognitive one, and knowing that distinction matters for how you apply the insight. The money you spend on a car registers as a purchase, but the return you don't earn on that same money doesn't register at all. So let's build a modeled scenario with assumptions stated clearly upfront, because these are illustrations and not predictions or guarantees. Assume a household is buying a new mid-priced vehicle and financing approximately $40,000 over 60 to 72 months at around 6.5 to 7%. Their all-in annual ownership cost, using the AAA framework from 2024 or 2025, runs somewhere between $11,500 and $12,300 per year. Over a 10-year horizon, this household will likely go through one full vehicle cycle and part of a second, paying the depreciation hit twice. The maintenance cost structure also changes because newer vehicles tend to have lower repair costs while older ones escalate after factory warranties expire. A 10-year modeled total cost, combining two vehicle periods with escalating maintenance in the back half, could reach into the range of $100,000 to $120,000. That is a modeled scenario and not a guarantee, because your specific numbers will depend on vehicle choice, location, mileage, and insurance costs. Now, add the opportunity cost layer, meaning what happens if a portion of that annual spend had been deployed differently? If $6,000 to $8,000 per year, representing the financing charges and depreciation specifically, had gone into a broad index fund, the compounding gap grows. The market's long-run historical average is roughly 7% annually on an inflation-adjusted basis, or closer to 10% in nominal terms. Neither figure is guaranteed. Markets have bad decades, and this comparison is illustrative and not investment advice of any kind. But the behavioral point stands regardless of the exact number you use in the model. Capital deployed into a depreciating asset is capital that isn't compounding elsewhere, and that asymmetry doesn't show up on a monthly payment statement. The Bureau of Labor Statistics confirms that transportation is the second largest spending category in the average American household budget. It consumes roughly 17 cents of every dollar spent, second only to housing, and more than 90% of that transportation spending goes to private vehicles. We are, as a country, extraordinarily car dependent. And we pay for that dependence at a scale most households have never actually added up. Here's where fairness matters, because the counter-argument to everything we just walked through is genuinely strong in certain contexts. For most Americans, a car is not optional, and if you live in a suburban or rural area, that describes a large majority of the country. Public transportation is either inadequate or non-existent in those areas, meaning a car is not a lifestyle choice, but actual infrastructure. When you compare the total cost of car ownership against the alternative of rideshare dependency, the math can actually favor ownership in ways that might surprise you. This is especially true for longer distances, irregular schedules, or households with children who need reliable and flexible transportation. There's also a meaningful difference between a new car and a well-chosen used one, and this is worth sitting with seriously. The AAA study is built around new vehicles, but a used car that has already absorbed the steepest depreciation changes the math substantially. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data confirms that new cars depreciate at roughly 12.1% annually, while used cars depreciate at closer to 10.3%. More importantly, you don't absorb the largest initial drop if you let someone else take it by buying a vehicle that's already 2 or 3 years old. Edmunds has written about this dynamic explicitly, noting that there's a meaningful cost advantage to buying a vehicle past its first major depreciation window. And there's a simpler version of the counterargument worth naming, which is that holding a vehicle for a long time changes everything. If you buy a practical vehicle at a reasonable price, finance it conservatively, maintain it properly, and drive it for 12 or 14 years, the math looks very different. The ownership cost per year drops substantially once the loan is paid off, and you're simply maintaining a paid-off vehicle with no financing charges. The people who come out ahead on the car cost question are typically not the ones who avoid cars, but the ones who buy carefully and hold long.
So what's the actual takeaway here? And it's narrower and more actionable than you might expect after all of that math.
The monthly payment is not the cost. The monthly payment is one cash flow among many, compressed into a single visible number. That framing makes the decision feel manageable, but the real cost includes financing, insurance, fuel, maintenance, depreciation, and the opportunity cost of capital you can't deploy elsewhere. It's a substantially larger number, and it compounds over a decade in ways that are genuinely worth understanding before you sign anything. The behavioral research on opportunity cost neglect explains why this gap persists between what people think car ownership costs and what it actually does. It's not that car buyers are careless, it's that our brains are wired to register the payment we're making and discount the return we're not earning.
The payment is vivid, and the compounding that isn't happening is invisible. And knowing that bias exists is the first step to actually accounting for it.
Here's the question worth keeping the next time you're looking at a vehicle and you already know the monthly payment.
What is the actual 5-year cost? And what could that same capital be doing if it weren't locked into a depreciating asset?
That question doesn't always produce the same answer, but it's almost always the right one to ask before you commit.
If you found this useful, a subscription helps this channel keep doing exactly this kind of work, breaking down the real math on decisions that feel smaller than they are.